This is The Big Conversation from Unbelievable with me, Justin Briley. The Big Conversation is a series of shows exploring faith, science, philosophy and what it means to be human in association with the Templeton Religion Trust. Welcome along to the show. Today we're debating morality. Can atheism deliver a better world? And the Big Conversation partners I'm sitting down with are Matt Dillahunty and Glenn Scrivener. Matt Dillahunty is a well-known voice in the world of atheist activism. He hosts the Atheist Experience call-in show and leads the atheist community of Austin. Glenn Scrivener is my other guest. He's the director of Speak Life, an organisation using modern media to bring the Christian message to a secular world. Glenn's videos have reached millions of people and often defend the Christian worldview against the atheist worldview. So today we'll be looking at the modern atheist movement. Can secular morality provide a better foundation for society than Christianity? And as people search for meaning in an increasingly post-Christian West, can atheism deliver the grounding needed for living a moral life? Glenn and Matt, welcome along to the show.
Great to be here.
It's great to have you both with me. Really looking forward to this one today. I've even donned my glasses, which you rarely see me in on this programme, but I lost a contact lens the other day, and so these are my backup.
You look
pair.
very studious. It's very
Thank you.
Yeah,
I hoped it would bring some gravitas to the programme.
I could grab my glasses if I need them.
It's all right. No.
We would outnumber Glenn.
Look, it's a real delight actually to have you here in the UK with us, Matt. You don't get over here very often, but I've seen you many a time through your YouTube videos and your speaking and lecturing and so on. Tell us a little bit about yourself. You began an atheist community out in Texas. Why did you do that? What was the reason behind it? Why did you start a call-in show about atheism?
Well, I didn't actually start this show, although that's a common misconception. I grew up Southern Baptist. My parents thought God wanted me to be a preacher. So did the people in my church, which was an interesting story. When I did a debate against Mike Licona, some of them showed up from out of the past.
From your former
30
church?
years ago,
Wow.
we thought you were going to be serving the Lord. What happened?
Okay.
But I found my way out of religion while trying to be a better Christian. Essentially, I thought that God was punishing me and took away my tech job because I hadn't become a preacher like he wanted. And so I said, okay, if that's what you want me to do, I'll do it. That kind of lengthy story led to me eventually realizing I wasn't a Christian or couldn't be a Christian, and kind of a search for what else might I be or what could I call myself. The Atheist Community of Austin has been around for 23, 24 years, and they started the Atheist Experience TV show, and it wasn't live initially. It was kind of recorded conversations. Eventually, it became a live call-in show, and I joined in 2005, which coincides with YouTube and everything else. And so that's when the show blew up and became something more than just, here's a public access TV, like Wayne's World type of thing.
Yeah.
And it became a little bit more. So it's fortunate that I joined when I did. Although, maybe I had a little something to do with the popularity of the show.
Well, and I think your face through it has become very well known, if you like, as a well-known face in the atheist movement. Now, I don't know if you think of atheism as a movement per se, or whether you've kind of become a leader in a movement. What's your thoughts on how atheism tends to portray itself to the public?
Yeah, I tend to draw a distinction. I mean, atheism from a purely philosophical position, it's just, I'm not convinced there's a God. But there are movements that are tied to atheism. There's a lot of kind of discussion and debates about what is the atheist movement and what counts as it. And of course, like any other movement, there's infighting and there's division. But I always viewed that as a positive thing, because when your group is big enough for you to split in two over a disagreement, then you're probably doing something right. Because until then, it was just a handful of people sitting around patting themselves on the back for not believing in God and complaining about religion and government and things like that. And we've moved on beyond that. Even if you just look at the Atheist Community of Austin and the programs that we're producing now, for years it was the Atheist Experience was the premier call-in show. It still is. And then we had Nonprofits, which was a pre-recorded kind of political discussion about separation of religion and government, and Godless Bitches for a while, which is going to be making a comeback, but talking about women's issues and things like that from a secular perspective, because a lot of that gets lost. We work with Foundation Beyond Belief, which is a secular charitable organization, and Recovering from Religion, which was founded by my friend Darrell Ray, And we often direct people to those resources because when people are finding their way out of religious belief, that's not trivial and it's not easy. And there are people who describe it as like, everybody in my family may have well have just died because now they're no longer there and I'm grieving this. There's a lot of issues surrounding that. And so we're producing more and more programs to kind of address the whole person so that it's not just, let me call in and argue with you about God.
Sure. I mean, what you're describing sounds almost like an atheist media production company producing different types of media, as you would find a Christian media production company like ours, producing different programs and so on. Are you the equivalent of the atheist TV evangelist, or is that not quite fair?
God, I hope not. I think
you haven't got
operate,
the hair for it. That's the problem.
Yeah, I think I operate considerably differently because it's not so much that I'm. If you watch the televangelists, what I see is there's communication coming from them. Ours instead is caller driven.
Okay.
Somebody calls in and tells me what they want. We have a discussion. Sometimes it gets heated. Sometimes I can be awful. I can be arrogant, condescending on occasion. Sometimes I hang up too quickly. But a lot of it is, I mean, it's all genuinely an attempt to, all right, let's figure out where our disagreements are. It's just that with people, with our call-in show, I'm not dealing with somebody who spent their life studying it, somebody who has some expertise in this. It's just the average believer most of the time. And because of that, they can't often distinguish between attacking a belief and attacking the person who holds the belief. And so even when you're not attempting to make anything personal, it might still be taken personally. It's a fine line to walk, and nobody's going to get it right all the time. But I think it's been incredibly valuable, not just in the fact that, we have thousands of people who would say, hey, I'm an atheist now or I'm a skeptic now because of what you've done on the show, but also because there are plenty of Christian apologists and preachers that I've made friends with over the years who still value that kind of conversation.
Sure. Yeah. Well, we're all about having the conversation here as well. So it's great to have you on the show today. Glenn, great to have you as well.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit of your background. You kind of grew up in a Christian setting. Was that always the case? Or?
Yeah, grew up in a church-going home. And I think during my teenage years, though I went to youth group and was the kid with the hand in the air getting the answers right. If you stick with Jesus, you're kind of onto a winner. Internally, I kind of had this idea that God was a large being far away, watching and waiting to spot my mistake. And found myself less and less compelled by that vision, and I think by the time I went away to university, I was pretty much done with Christianity and didn't want to really have anything to do with church or that sort of thing. But I think towards the end of my university career, studying philosophy of religion and ethics and meta-ethics and these sorts of things, and starting to think through why the intuitions of my heart that were that love is the greatest thing and that a life of love is the greatest value, and a friend who was challenging me to read through the Gospels and get back to the heart and soul of Christianity, Jesus Christ. And I remember reading through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and just thinking halfway through Luke's Gospel, if God's like Jesus, I'm in. And so that was a real turning point for me, aged about 21. And I kind of jumped in with both feet at that stage and really started loving church, having hated it before, and started loving getting into conversations, the way that Matt loves getting into conversations with people. I then found a graduate job afterwards that I was not very suited for, for office work, and then discovered that you could do this thing for a living and started working for churches since the year 2000, and I've been shooting my mouth off about Jesus ever since then.
Yeah. And that's kind of what you're here to do, in as much as you're here to engage with Matt on the issue of atheism. Can it deliver a better world? We're going to look at the issue of morality, unpack all the issues there as well. What about the atheist movement as a whole, though? I want to maybe tease that out a bit as we start today's show. How have you seen it develop in the years that you've been, obviously, as a Christian, engaging with the secular world and seeing, I guess, different forms of atheism emerging in that time?
Well, I guess there's not just one atheist movement, just as there's not one atheism. I think, John Gray's latest book, The 7 Types of Atheism, puts pay to the lie that there's only one way of being an atheist or one kind of metaphysical outlook that you could describe as atheism. But I guess what I've been very used to in the last 20 or so years, maybe a bit less than that, is the sort of the what's being described as the new atheism. I remember debating Andrew Copsom, the chief executive of the British Humanist Association, who has been on this show a number of times, I believe, and I was debating him in Oxford. I guess this must have been about 8 years ago, and the crowd was vibrant and it was pulsating, and it felt like lions thrown to the Christians thrown to the lions.
Yeah.
It felt very much like I was in a minority of one,
Right.
against a whole room that was very much of a Dawkins style of atheism.
You felt that was the overwhelming kind of feeling in the room was that they were backing that kind of atheist
in
type
that
of view?
moment,
Okay.
that it would be a better thing if religion ceased to exist. And then what was interesting is Facebook reminded me, the time hop thing reminds you that 8 years ago you were in Oxford, and I happened to be in Oxford last year to see a Jordan Peterson talk. And I happened to see a number of people, some prominent atheists from the atheist community, like Cosmic Skeptic was there, and a number of people who were at the debate that I was at 8 years ago. And suddenly they were listening to Jordan Peterson, who's a very different voice,
Yes.
A secular voice still, although he has a much grander vision for the place of religion in society. And it made me see that things have moved on,
Right.
in 8 years, and there are other strands to this. And you start reading people like Jonathan Haidt, and you start reading people like David Sloan Wilson, and they again have a place for religion, even though they themselves might be atheists. And so I think it's a mistake, and sometimes Christians make the mistake of thinking that every atheist is Richard Dawkins. And yet he is one brand of one kind of atheism. And really, you need to have a better conversation with people. You need to figure out what they actually believe. I could assume all sorts of things about Matt's metaphysical beliefs without ever having actually interrogated them. And I think that's what's really great about having a conversation and saying, oh, but what do you actually believe about morality, metaphysics, morals?
Yeah.
That kind of thing,
It's interesting you talk about, essentially, I would think you'd be describing the tone of things 8 years ago versus this. And while I don't look at it as if there are different types of atheism, I look at it as, atheism is a thing, but there are different atheists and they're going to have different ways of doing things, but also just the general tone of things is going to change. In the United States, around the time that Sam wrote End of Faith, and there was, the initial rise of what was called new atheism, which annoys a lot of us because it's not new. It's, I guess, a new activism on behalf of it.
Yeah, I think that's what was new about it, was that maybe the tone and the way it was being put across, and the fact that the internet was now fueling it.
Well, we were also, at that time, Bush was president, there were concerns about evangelicals encroaching on government. And then, there was that ramp up, and then Obama becomes president, and, we legalize same-sex marriage, we do a bunch of stuff that, and not that all atheists are remotely liberal progressives, but there's a good chunk of them that are in that category. And so we were having conferences all the time. I think I did 12, 13, 14 conferences in 1 year. That sort of died down, and there was concern that people, atheism has had its heyday, and now they're done. And I think really what happened is that the environment we were living in changed, and now there were other things to worry about. You didn't feel like there was this encroachment of religion in your life as much, and that has shifted, of course, since Trump's been elected.
Right.
But the tone and how people are doing things changes. And, I can look back on the early days doing the show, and I was, right. And now there's a lot less of that.
You're a bit more chilled out now.
But yeah, there's tons of, I think we need a number of different approaches because, first of all, not everybody believes for the same reason. They're not going to give it up for the same reason. And if I'm going to be trying to educate myself on which believers are going to give the most compelling justifications for their belief or the best descriptions of the worldview they want to have, then I have to go into, without doing the I'm right, you're wrong, not nearly so much as I'm just not convinced, can you convince me? And we end up having much more conversations, or much more stringent conversations about epistemology,
right,
and what is in fact justified, even if it turns out we agreed on the actual political positions and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, sticking with the atheist movement per se, I think there are those who want atheism just to be that negative concept of simply not having belief in God. and others who do see it as allied to a whole set of, propositions about the way we should treat each other, LGBT issues, and so on. And what's your view? Where do you feel like, if I say I'm an atheist, does it entail anything along those lines?
I don't think so. Once you identify as an atheist, I just stick with that label that you're not convinced there's a God. Doesn't tell me anything else about you. But it's undeniable that, like, for example, the Atheist Community of Austin has a list of position statements. I know because I wrote them. And it took quite a while to get the board of directors on board with us having these position statements. I wasn't redefining atheism. I was defining what the atheist community of Austin is going to do, what our group was going to be doing. And this is why the simple answer to your question, which can atheism lead us to a better world? No, it can't. If you're looking at atheism as just that.
Yeah.
If you ask, can secular humanism, can these kind of values that we're packaging together that people care about that happen to be held by some atheists, they're not exclusive to atheism at all. I don't require that everybody I spend time with agree with me on everything. And I don't assume that just because somebody shared a stage or something with them. I mean, because I shared a stage with Dawkins. There's plenty of people who have problems with him. I shared a stage with Harris. I shared a stage with Jordan Peterson. Those were different, though. If Sam Harris and I are sitting down together, the presumption is, these two are in alignment and in agreement, which is true most of the time. There are things that Sam and I disagree about. When I sit down with Jordan Peterson, the assumption is, this is the head-to-head conflict.
Right.
And the interesting thing is that I don't know Glenn at all. And there are people who are going to assume, this is the big battle. But I don't look at debates or these kind of discussions as if they're WWE events. This is a genuine conversation. I find myself challenging people in the atheist community far more often than I'm, having conflicts with people who are religious of any type.
Which is a great attitude to have. But I think these days what we tend to see is cancel culture. What we tend to see is if you've got the wrong views about things, a prescribed set of views that have only really, arisen in the last 5 minutes, if you don't toe the line on a number of different orthodoxies, and I use that word advisedly, orthodoxies, then you are kind of put outside the camp. And again, I use that word, advisedly. It's very religious language, isn't it?
It's yes.
And it's partly, I think, where the interest is coming for folks like Jordan Peterson and Douglas Murray and Brett Weinstein and others, the so-called intellectual dark web, who are perhaps pushing against what some people see as this sort of politically correct. From a secular point of view, and I find that there's some interesting bedfellows then between Christians who find themselves on the same kind of side as those guys, and they may be set against other secular people who are far more progressive in their views and that kind of thing. I mean, it is an interesting sort of time at which there's a whole new set of questions that are being put on the table.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to the ineradicability of a religious spirit to humanity.
Okay.
And I do think that one of the things that I think has sort of marked out the new atheism, if we want to give any labels to anywhere, would be the belief that it would be a better thing for society if far fewer people were religious. And I think that certainly captured the four horsemen of the apocalypse, of the atheist apocalypse, Hitchens and Dawkins and Dennett and Harris. They certainly wanted to see people deconverted from Christianity in order to see a more flourishing and better world. But I kind of think Dostoevsky was wrong when he said, when there is no God, everything is permitted. I think what we're seeing is when there is no gods, everything is very puritanical, and everything becomes actually even more heightened in its moralism. And I think what we've found is getting rid of God at that level of public discourse has actually led to people pronouncing anathemas on people and burning them at the stake and going on witch hunts.
See, and I don't think this is actually so much tied to atheism. So what I see a lot of is people are talking past each other, and people on both sides of an issue are engaged in hyperbole and perhaps not the most honest assessment of what they view as the opposition. But the sort of thing that Glenn's talking about, it's not as if atheism is the foundation behind cancel culture or whatever you want to say. No, it is political ideologies and people who have I will brook no disagreement, and I am not interested in any conversation. If you've said this, you are done. And if you're willing to associate with somebody who said this or whatever, then you are also done.
Yeah, no, I don't think
that's not even an atheist thing.
Yeah, no,
that's
I certainly don't think exactly. It's human nature. I think someone like Jonathan Haidt would say in The Righteous Mind that we all orbit around these little totem poles. of highest value, and those totem poles bind and blind. They bind together communities, but they blind us against what the other communities are saying. And therefore, an atheist community can be just as religious in that sense as a Christian community, a Muslim community, a Buddhist community, because we all have these highest ideals. We're all involved in motivated reasoning. We all have our in-group, we all have our out-group, and we can all engage in behavior that is more or less tolerant of one another. And then the question becomes, well, how do we relate towards one another? And the one thing that then rules out is we can't then have an irreligious solution to the problem of these different communities.
Yeah.
Is that a fair comment, though, that atheism in that sense is quite religious when it gets its expression in these ways, Matt?
So I'm always going to push back on this atheism thing, but just as far as the label. But yes, speaking kind of colloquially, of course it can be like that because there are humans involved, and this is what humans do. My only concern with religions at all is there any good reason to believe they're true? I would not, people will say, oh, religion's never done anything good. Well, that's crap. Religions have done lots of good things. Or actually, more accurately, people who are religious have done good things. They've given us universities, hospitals. That would be true probably as much for secular people as well if it weren't for a disparity in the sort of privileged position that religion has had and benefited from for all these years. Secular organizations had to do a lot more fighting and in a lot more recent time just to get a similar status. For example, tax-exempt status in the United States. It's just, if you're a religion, as long as you're one of the recognized religions, you're just granted it de facto. We're a Baptist church, we're a Catholic church, we're a Unitarian Universalist. Even the Buddhists had to fight for property tax exemption in Austin because it wasn't on the list of approved religions. Okay. The Satanic Temple just recently got approved by pretty sure it's the IRS as a religious organization, so they can have a tax exempt status. And that always seems strange to me. I realize I'm in the UK talking about American politics, but I've always had a problem with the notion that in the American Constitution, the United States Constitution, where we get to this notion that you are tax exempt because you're a religious organization is incredibly convoluted. And it puts the government in a strange position of saying, hey, you're a church, you're not a church. How do you allow that decision to be made at the government level and not come to the conclusion that there's a necessary problem there with entanglement between religion and government? Because if the religion can decide if the government can decide which religions are good enough for tax exempt,
and that was a big issue with Scientology, wasn't it? A few years ago, they
fought like crazy.
A big battle to be recognised as a religion. I mean, obviously, sometimes there are differences between one side of the pond and the other, Glenn, with these issues. But it's interesting that Matt is willing to say, yeah, it can, to all intents and purposes, look rather religious in some ways.
Well, I mean, to the point of why should churches have tax-exempt status? I mean, there's a big debate going on in Australia, where I'm from right now, about that very question. I mean, one of the issues to throw into the mix is that there is a tremendous amount of public benefit for religions to flourish in societies. So when you look at the studies, you see that those who have an intrinsic religiosity, that is, those who identify as religion's the most important thing to me, it helps me to frame the rest of my life. If you ask those people on any kinds of measures of reproduction, how many babies do you have? Longer life? Are you happier? Will you have more of a resistance to depression, to recovery from illness, recovery from surgery? Do you have a resistance to divorce, to suicide? There are any number of factors where an intrinsic religiosity, that is, a body of people who are saying that their religion means the world to them, those people thrive in a world where, if the government was able to put that into the water, if they were able to put a magic elixir into the water that could deliver those benefits, longer life, for goodness sakes, happier, healthier, they give more money to charity. They give more money to secular charities than secular people do. They give more time to secular charities than secular people do. They give more blood than secular people give. All these things have been demonstrated in thousands of studies. So throw that into the mix as a government is looking at what will lead to the flourishing of society, what could make society better. Actually, intrinsic religiosity is something that could definitely do that. So,
and see, here's where we get to disagreement. But it's going to be difficult,
okay,
because I don't have access to go look at studies and everything else. But if you do a Google search for religiosity versus societal health, there's a study that was done years ago that was in the Journal of Religious Education. I'm going to get
2005. Is it Gregory S. Paul?
Yes, Gregory S. Paul.
Yeah,
which
paleontologist.
Shows something different, but
yeah.
In any
he's
case,
a paleontologist who was actually hacked off with creationists. You go to Wikipedia and you find Gregory S. Paul.
But that's all about Gregory S. Paul. I'm talking about his data.
You've been quoting him for 15 years, though.
I know, but I'm quoting his data, not him.
Yeah, but he's one study against thousands of others, and he swims against a tide of literally 89% of the studies show that everything goes in the other direction. He did a univariate analysis about secularity and how it relates to public benefits.
Sure, and I'm not saying that
and he cherry-picked his results.
Oh, all right. Well, see, now we're in a different thing, because if we're going to start making accusations that his study's not wrong, or is not good because he cherry-picked it, I have problems with the other studies.
I'm not aware of the study, so could you just explain what's in the study, just so that
that's the thing. Without
saying
this isn't what I came in prepared to discuss, so I don't want to get the study wrong. The point I'm making is that
you've been getting it wrong for 15 years.
I've been getting what wrong for 15 years? What his study says?
His study is a univariate analysis of how secularity within European countries is indexed to a whole different number of things, like murder rates and that kind of thing. He didn't look at other things like crime rates and that sort of thing, because it didn't help his analysis.
Sure,
so
you are pointing to problems that you have with his methodology, but that's not me getting wrong what his report says.
Why are you camping out on his study, when literally there are thousands of studies that show the benefits of religion?
Well, I was getting to that a minute ago.
Okay.
Because a number of the things that in the studies that you would cite, I would also have a problem with their methodology. Because when you talk about, first of all, you've got the issue of self-reporting. How happy are you? And we know, for example, especially from ex-Mormons, that groups like Mormon culture encourage people to, because they are representatives of the church, to present themselves as happier when less problematic. Now, who knows what the actual truth is there? And I'm not saying what the truth is. What I'm saying is there's an issue with self-reporting. There's also an issue with what is the real foundation here? Is it that they are religious, which, by the way, is independent from the truth of the religious proposition? That's why the challenge that I had for years was show me a real, true benefit of religion that is necessarily only produced by the truth of that religion. Because you can produce those same things with a compelling lie. If you've got five religions and only one of them is true, but all five of those people, religious individuals or people who are adherents to those are reporting that they're better and happier and these other things, then it has nothing to do with the truth of the religion. It has to do with who we are. And it may be the case that what people need is the community, which religions have done a really good job of building those communities. And it's one of the things that secular organizations are working towards doing now, building stronger communities. But we had to fight for just the right to exist and be open and talk about this before we could get to a point of building those sorts of communities.
I mean, it's interesting. We've gone to this area of what is the value of religion, Christianity specifically, I suppose, in your case, Glenn. I mean, are you saying that the science seems to suggest that actually there's something about doing the things of religion, whether it be the community aspect, but also, I suppose, the ritual, the belief, the prayer, that is in some way we're kind of made for, in some way psychologically, that is our natural state, whereas you don't think that's the case with someone who adopts an atheist perspective on the world?
I think you can go there and you can make the argument that this seems to fit the human person better, therefore it might be more likely to be true. You could go there, but before you even go there, I think it's important that this difference between intrinsic religiosity and extrinsic religiosity is kind of
just explain what those
out.
two terms are.
So intrinsic religiosity is you don't treat religion like a means to an end. So your wife goes to church, and so you go to church too, just to keep her happy. That would be extrinsic religiosity.
Okay.
Or you like the community, or the pastor's not such a bad guy, and you guys go bowling on a Friday, and that's fine. That would be extrinsic religiosity. But the key question that would identify you as intrinsically religious would be, this is the most important thing to my life, or this is what helps me frame the rest of my decisions, or that kind of thing. And it's that seems to make the difference. So not just that you have community, but that you seem to be oriented towards something that is higher, something that is transcendent. That seems to give that added effect.
And I wouldn't even dispute that.
Okay.
We do some funny things with language. When people are like, "Oh, you don't believe in anything higher than yourself," and I'm like, "Well, what do you mean by higher? Do you mean that not that I'm just basally selfish? Matt is the superior. There's nothing higher than Matt." No, because there are things that I value. There are things that I would sacrifice my time and energy for as well. There are folks who come, for example, to the atheist community of Austin, where this community has saved their lives. People who were suicidal, who were ostracized by family, who felt alone and everything else. And it has become essentially the most important thing to them. I think one of the differences is that I try to make sure that we're discouraging any sort of like, but I wouldn't deny or even object to the notion that the sorts of things that you're describing as religiosity are important to humans and may in fact be beneficial. My objection is to whether or not there's actually a truth behind that, an actual God thing. If it turns out, I used to irritate some atheists because I would say, I can prove to you that prayer works, and I can demonstrate it right now. Because if you're in a cave-in and you pray, you are more likely to be rescued. Not because there's some God listening to answer that, but because prayer has a calming effect on you, which extends the amount of time that you can be trapped, which extends the likelihood that you can be rescued. The question then becomes, if you know that it's the calming that extends the amount of time, could you do the same thing with meditation? Or does the awareness that it's the calming somehow eliminate the benefit of it? And that's the thing that I think we don't know.
I mean, are you interested in a sense, though, like the New Atheist Project to some extent, in deconverting people, getting them out of those beliefs? And if you do, do you run the danger of actually creating a worse kind of life for them, because actually they may not make that transition into a secular version of the well-being that religion may have given them up to that point? I mean, it can be quite a really harsh process, deconverting. It can be terrible.
And one of the things that we see undeniably within some people who leave religion, who identify as atheists, is they often fall into nihilistic kind of, wouldn't say often, occasionally fall into. Some of us don't have any issue with that at all. And so it's not I'd never pretend that there's no problems or anything else. First of all, I don't go door to door. Hey, have you stopped believing in Jesus yet? I can fix that. We take incoming calls, so we're having conversations with the people that want to.
Yeah.
And I think that if all we're doing is actually questioning the reasoning behind a belief, in the same way that truth is always a defense to slander, that's what we're engaged in. How much responsibility, if somebody gives up their religion because of what I said, and they have negative consequences because of that, how much of that am I responsible for? This is something that I've considered quite a bit. What I find is that the people who end up suffering the negative consequences, the core problem there still goes back to religion. It's like if somebody told you when you're 30 you're going to inherit $1 billion, and you get to be 30 and you find out you're wrong. Now your life may be crap from that point on, because you may have lived as if you were going to inherit $1 billion and you didn't. You may have built up expectations and changed your fundamental perspective on the world, so that once it's not true, you're now miserable, maybe you're bankrupt and everything else. But it's not learning that you did not inherit $1 billion that was the problem. It was the false promise of $1 billion at the beginning that was the problem.
Yeah. I mean, I guess from your perspective as well as a Christian, Glenn, you don't want people to be Christians just because of the benefits it brings in terms of, the community and the lifestyle and the psychological well-being. So you're interested in truth as well, just
Absolutely.
as much as Matt.
Yeah.
What if we found out the happiest way to be was just to be high on heroin all the time?
Right.
We do know there's
rat in a cage with
we do know there's big negative consequences that long term, so I don't think that's likely as a possibility.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it needs to be existentially grounded. I think it needs to be true in order to live out that life. Because, life is a wager. I am constantly I don't mean this in the religious sense at all. Life is an act of faith. I step out into the world not knowing what's going to hit me. Am I going to open myself out to the world in a certain way that will make me vulnerable, that will make me weak, that could get me attacked, but in another sense it could help people. All of life is a venture of faith. And if it's not true, then I'm a fool, And I think, Christianity is a venture to be in Jesus and with Jesus, extending my arms out to the world the same way that he was in sacrificial love. If God is not on the other side of that, raising me up again, which is the Easter story, cross and resurrection, then I am to be pitied more than all men, which is what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. So I absolutely believe that we have common cause on this one. It must be true. But if it is true, I think that is what explains its workability.
Right.
There are some people, I've done debates online with people who are very much atheists in the mold of Jonathan Haidt and David Sloan Wilson, and
who see the usefulness of religion. In that sense.
Right. It's metaphorically true, so which is true enough. And really, the debates we seem to have had, they seem to have been saying, well, to live this way, i.e., in this moral way, works, therefore it's true. And I kept on saying, well, no, I think it's true, and therefore it works.
Right.
And I think that's where I come to with that brand of atheist. I do think you need to ground it in what is actually true about the world. But I think an inference to the best explanation for why it is that religion actually does work in the world is that it is true.
I mean, Matt says that you need to give secular humanism a chance. It hasn't had a long time to actually get going and create community, and potentially you will see all the same benefits accrue to someone who simply says, well, that's my way of finding meaning in the world. I don't have to have a
I don't know if I'd say.
Oh, maybe you wouldn't. Well, what would you say?
I come pretty close.
Okay.
So one of the things is when Jordan Peterson and I sat down, I pointed out that there's never been a secular humanist government, and he tried to say that the Soviet Union was, and he just doesn't understand what secular humanism is. That wasn't secular humanism. That was basically state-enforced atheism, and was very much anti-religion. And so if we're going to use the language, we can certainly separate the types of things that we would put in a bucket as religiosity. Maybe it's a sense of awe. Atheists can have a sense of awe. Maybe it's the notion that there's something that may be greater than the self that you might want to consider yourself with. I think so. I think there are concepts, truth and freedom. I think that, the society that I benefit, that I'm also a part of, needs to be considered. You can't be myopic when you're looking at something like well-being and just say, well, this benefits me. Who cares what it does to anybody else? Because we're intertwined. But there were a couple, to kind of go back to something that Glenn mentioned, I would agree that if there were a God, we'll stick with the Christian God so that we don't have to drag everybody else into it today. But if there were a God, that would be a sufficient explanation for why some of these devout religious tendencies seem to be beneficial to the practitioner. In the same way that if there were a God, that would explain some of the things that creationists point to with regard to design. My concerns on these are separate. Yes, of course, that would be sufficient, but is it actually true? Because we've done this over and over again, where we make an inference to an explanation based on whatever limited knowledge and information we have right now, and then we find out later we got it wrong. And every time we found out later that we got it wrong, it was scientific exploration and discovery that found out it was wrong. And at no point have we ever found out we were wrong about a God.
What do you make of that, Jen?
Well, is secular humanism new? In one sense, yes, quite new. In another sense, I think it's a repackaging of Christianity light. I do think Nietzsche's critique holds that secular humanism tends to be Christianity where God is swapped out for the good.
But to the extent that's true, couldn't we just say that Christianity is the Hammurabic code swapped out or upgraded or changed, or that all of this is derivative? At some point, we're talking about human beings and how they choose to try to answer the questions and live lives cooperatively. Whether you're going back to animism and some tribal struggle, then this becomes a more codified sort of language, and when people aren't paying attention to it and the village elder is no longer a sufficient authority, we appeal to one outside of there. I mean, this would also be a sufficient explanation for the history of religion. So to say that secular humanism is a newly packaged, light, modified version of Christianity really isn't relevant if Christianity is a modified version of other things that all tie back to the human being.
Which is a big if, and I don't think it is at all. I think what you get when you look at human civilizations, what you get when you look at the Hammurabi Code, or when you look at the Enuma Elish, when you look at any number of the ancient Near Eastern texts, when you look at any number of Greco-Roman understandings of the world, or Persian understanding of the world, or Muslim understanding of the world, it is basically that in the realm of the flesh, in the realm of biological reality, it is survival of the fittest, and therefore sacrifice of the weakest. And I think what you get absolutely uniquely in Christianity is the reverse of that. You have in Christ the fittest who is sacrificed for the survival of the weakest. And what you get birthed out of the Christian movement is a unique preference for the poor, the marginalized, the weak, the outsider, to draw them in, such that obviously in every society there's tit for tat, and there's let's cooperate and let's do all that kind of stuff. But who is we in that sentence? Let us cooperate. Well, who's the us? It could be just you and me and not Justin, or it could be just me and Justin and not you, right? Who are the people on planet Earth who are actually saying it's actually all of us, even our enemies, are those who we include in the circle of humanity, and who we grant equal human dignity to, and who we say they must never be marginalized, no matter how weak they are, no matter how ineffectual they are, no matter how maladapted to survival they are ours, and we will grant them a universal human dignity. That's a thoroughly Christian idea, and it's not, it's obviously it's found on the first page of the Bible, so it's there in Judaism, but it is a uniquely Christian idea that I think secular humanism has taken on. But I don't think you derive that secular humanism anywhere else but in Christianity.
And Judaism.
Mm-hmm. Let's call it the Judeo-Christian worldview,
sure.
or whatever.
Let's credit the Abrahamic God with everything. And when I look at it, my issue is, if there is an Abrahamic God, okay, that's an important question, which I guess we're going to somewhat sideline, because at the end of the day, this notion that human beings who care about human beings are not going to come up with multiple different ways of structuring a society, and that some of those, which may be consistent with your view and understanding of Christianity, which I would argue is perhaps different than some other people's view and understanding of Christianity. I don't think that's particularly contentious at this point. Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean that this is Christianity light and modified and updated, or that it's all derived from Christianity as the original source, because that presumes that there's something other than human beings that are the original source for those ideas. The fact that they became popular within Christianity, that you have somebody talking about blessed are the meek, did that ultimately lead some people to the United Nations Universal Code of Human Ethics type stuff and secular humanism? Sure. Because we're all together on a planet and these ideas get passed around. And my take on it has always been, take the best ideas wherever you find them, get rid of the rest. And so from the Bible, I can pull out some really good ideas and I can get rid of its support for slavery or genocide or misogyny or any of those things. I don't have to hang on to the baggage or claim that I'm doing it because there's
in a sense, though,
God.
you're getting rid of everything, including God, obviously, in the process of doing that. And it is your argument, Glenn, that there's a danger in doing that. You can't simply have the ethics without some of the supporting foundations, presumably, that you think are...
Which is Nietzsche's critique as well. Yeah, absolutely. That you get rid of the God of Christianity, and you must get rid of the ethics of Christianity as well, because it is founded on the God who took flesh, who became the weak one, in order to rise up again and bring us weak ones into his family. And he uniquely gives to the entire human race a dignity. which you can kind of secularize that term and call it the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But that's basically the Imago Dei. That's basically the image of God from Genesis chapter 1.
So wait, on one hand, you seem to be saying you can't remove God and still maintain these things, and yet you're claiming that secular humanism has done exactly that.
Secularism has done exactly that, or hasn't done exactly
has done exactly that. That when I advocate for secular humanist principles, when I do that I'm basically taking the principles that you see in Christianity and just removing God from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So clearly you can do that.
You can do that, but on what grounds now is every human being in the image of God, or now in this new updated term, is every human being now included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
This is the thing that I keep running up against is I have yet to find anybody presenting an objection to secular morality that is in any way solved by appealing to a religious one. The big thing that you get to is, well, what's the foundational source and why should I care about it? This is where when Sam writes Moral Landscape and people are like, well, you haven't fully explained well-being. Of course, we haven't. I mean, this is the process where we're continuing to discover things. Well, why should anybody care about well-being is the big question that Sam always gets asked. And that this question also applies to why should anybody care about what a God says? And this is one of the things where whether or not there's a God, I don't necessarily see any evidence when I look at Christianity in particular, at least the way I understood it when I was a Christian, that there's a God who has human interests at heart. It's humans who have human interests at heart. So not only would secular humanism stand with regard to Occam's razor, but the thing that we're appealing to is the very thing that we're seeking to do, which is we care about us. Why do we care about us? We care about us because we're us. Now, when you add in the God of Christianity, you get the notion that, no, God's got a plan. You are a part of that plan. And okay, he loves you and he's making a place to either torture you or rescue you too. And he can serve as a foundation that we can point to so that we don't have to point to ourselves. But nowhere in there is there any sort of guarantee that there either is a God, or B, that God has the actual best interests of humans at heart. It's just an appeal that God understands these things better than we do. And so when it seems like God doesn't have the best interests of humans at heart, that's just our failure to understand it, which is really fallacious reasoning.
Except that Christianity is about God the human. I mean, foundationally, Christianity is Christ. It's foundationally, God the Son has become God our brother. We've just celebrated Christmas. It's the time at which the Word became flesh, which is just a stunning religious idea that is found nowhere else. Disgusting to my Muslim friends. You know, it's disgusting to the Greco-Roman mind. And yet, the Christian claim uniquely is that God took flesh and even became a single cell in Mary's womb, became the weak and despised thing for the sake of all weak and despised things. And I think from there you get the principle that humanity in and of itself has a dignity because God has so dignified it. Otherwise, it's us elevating humanity to a certain, position. Why should we elevate humanity to a certain position? Why should there be such a thing as human exceptionalism?
Why shouldn't there be?
Is that just a power play, right?
I mean, I'm not just asking that to like,
yep. Do you have an answer? Like, what do you think about human exceptionalism?
I don't really see any reason why it shouldn't be. Well, of course we're going to be concerned about our own well-being. Mm-hmm. When you talk about, there's
that moral though, or is that just a power play?
So this is the thing when we talk about what is moral. So quite often they'll say, well, the thing you're describing, that's all well and good, but it's not morality. Fine, then I don't care about morality. You need to tell me what you're going to, because if the only thing you're going to count is morality, is some sort of, divine command or a supernatural being that serves as a grounding for whatever you want to do, that's not what I think anybody's ever really cared about for morality. When we talk about morals, when we talk about this, we're evaluating the consequences of our actions with respect to some goal, and does it ultimately increase, decrease, or have no effect on our well-being? Which is why I think Sam went with well-being. I didn't used to use that. I used a different language when I did my talk.
But you fundamentally agree with Sam Harris that that's something we can objectively measure through, say, scientific means, as long as we know what benefits, what generally humans want in their lives.
I think you can do objective assessments, objective evaluations with respect to a standard.
As far as you're concerned.
You don't have an objective reason why you care about that standard, just like you don't have an objective reason why you care about a God. If there was a God, he should come along and kind of clarify all this. I would think that would be a duty. But the beautiful story that you're talking about, where the most powerful being comes down and becomes a cell, becomes one of the weak, one of the fallen, in order to save them. That's an incredibly nice way to package it, but I have, I guess, a completely different take on it, because the story is a little different. The story starts in Genesis, where God creates everybody, and then it all screws up, and then he tries to fix it, and it screws up, and he tries to fix it, and it screws up. It's this parade, it's this comedy of errors. And then you get to a spot where God, who's been demanding that we slaughter animals and burn them because he likes barbecue, is now decided that he's going to come down and take human form and sacrifice himself to himself for a weekend to fix everything for everybody. That's blood magic. That is sacrificial blood magic thinking, and nothing to do about human value.
Who actually believes that? What you just described as a summary of Christianity. Who actually believes?
How could you not? Did God come down and become human,
God
sacrifice himself?
Said, God the Son became God our brother.
He's still God.
God the Son became God our brother. Right?
But
the Son.
Are you a non-Trinitarian? Sorry.
That's precisely because I'm Trinitarian. God the Son,
right,
became God our brother, full of the Holy Spirit.
Okay.
In order to unite us as family back to the same source, back to the Father. This is basic Trinitarian theology.
Did God not sacrifice himself?
The Father sent the Son.
But they're the same.
They're not the same.
They're part of the Trinity.
Yeah, they are definitely.
They are one, right?
They are definitely part of the
Are they one, though?
They are united, absolutely. The Father, Son, and Spirit.
United. I mean, we're united at a table, but we're not one.
Mm-hmm. The Father is in the Son, and the Son is in the Father, so that they are united on a level that is far superior to ours. But
why does there need to be a blood sacrifice?
Well, because to walk away from God, to be disconnected from life, means death, right? And in the Bible, the life is in the blood.
Well, who made that rule?
It's the nature of the case, don't you think? If God is life, God is a source of life.
Couldn't God have done it differently?
Well, if God is the source of life and we reject life, what does that leave us with? Death. If God wants to unite with us in our death, what will he have to take on? Our death.
So you're talking, first of all, you're speaking kind of metaphorically here, because I'm not rejecting life. I'm rejecting a proposition that there's some eternal life because I don't see sufficient evidence for it. If there is, cool. But God, this notion, why does there need to be a blood sacrifice at all? At some point we were running around killing animals and doing it because God loved the smell of burning flesh. Literally, it says that. Now, while it's, I know what part of the objection is. It's like the Easter story when atheists will say, and then the zombies rose up and marched on Jerusalem, and people will be like, there's nothing in the Bible about zombies. But it does talk about the dead getting up out of their graves and going in there. And so it's a colloquialism to refer to it as zombies. I don't think even the atheists, by and large, are thinking that we're talking walking dead here. But it's a shorthand to show that there's something that's potentially absurd here, an extraordinary claim that doesn't have evidence for it. This isn't even that. This isn't even an extraordinary claim that doesn't have evidence for it. This is, to me, bizarre. What is it about killing something that God needs you to do in order for God to forgive you? Because if God is the creator of everything, including the rules of how all this works, couldn't he have come up with rules that don't involve killing things?
Well, I mean, first of all, the priest was many other things, but he was also your butcher, right? You would eat the lamb after you sacrificed it. You would eat the bull. You know, we still go to the butcher. We still sacrifice our animals. And in that sacrifice, even today, in a very secular sense, the death of that animal means our life. In that very literal sense, okay? That animal dies so that we might live. And it's just that in the Old Testament, it was also teaching a spiritual dimension. On top of the barbecues that we all love. You're from Texas, I'm from Australia, we love barbecues, okay?
The vegans are going to hate us.
It was a great conversation with Cosmic Skeptic, by the way. On top of that butchery, there was also a spiritual lesson being taught. And the spiritual lesson being taught was not that the blood of this bull is paying for your sin, but that there is a Messiah who is coming who will pay for your sins. Because, no, the blood of goats and bulls cannot pay for sin, but God can take responsibility for his handiwork. And God did take responsibility for his handiwork, and it was his death that actually paid for sin. That's the story.
I mean, I want to move us on from what is a very
Sure.
interesting theological debate at this point. We may move us back a bit to the central thesis of this
Sure.
whole thing. I mean, we've been asking, can atheism deliver a better world? Talking about this in the context of morality, Matt. First of all, from the outset, what do you say just to that question? We haven't even asked that yet. Can atheism deliver a better world? What's your sort of...
I have no idea. I've never suggested that atheism or even secular humanism guarantees a better world. First of all, we're always dealing with human beings. And so you can come up with whatever rule system you want. And it's like, I got a thing wrong on the show the other day. Somebody was talking about natural family planning, and I confused it with the rhythm method, and I kind of mocked it. There's nothing wrong with natural family planning other than you have to actually follow it diligently, and it will result in you having sex less often. And then within the Roman Catholic Church, they are required to just abstain rather than using alternate things during fertility. There's nothing, I'm not saying that secular humanism it guarantees a better world. But even if we take what Glenn's saying, even if you were to look at this as Christianity light without the God thing, I would already view that as better because A, we guarantee that we have humans' best interests at heart. That's humanism. It's the foundation of it. You can say, and you would be correct, that it's just a bold, bald assertion that we should care about humans. Okay? I have no response to that. I don't even know why anybody would want to come up with a response. There's nothing that says the world will be better this way, except for this. I did a debate in a Church of Christ where I told them I could write a better book than the Bible and I could prove it to them. Because I could rewrite it word for word, reverse its position on slavery, and it would be a better book. Because for the people who are looking at this, not so much as metaphorical lessons or like that, if they're looking at this as an instruction book for life, that book advocates slavery. That's not even a question. If you were to say, thou shalt not own a human being as property, that would be better than saying you can and that you can pass them on. And so this was the example I used for the people who are kind of like Bible worshipers, not the people who go in looking for, hey, there's an interesting message here, or they're going to tell me something about my life, but no, this is literally word for word, blah, That type of mindset is probably more responsible for the harm and damage that a lot of us would lay at the foot of Christianity than Glenn's version, for sure. I mean, I don't think Glenn's pro-slavery at all. And when you start looking at things where you are finding a way to take a message that could easily be viewed as this is a blood magic sacrifice and say, well, life has to consume life to exist, and you want to kind of maybe blow off why God would have made it that way or why it had to be made that way, which is a weird and interesting theological discussion. Getting rid of those things and keeping the good parts is all I've advocated for ever. And secular humanism, to me, is taking the good parts, whether they're found in Christianity, Judaism, Scientology.
And who's
I doubt that
deciding
one a
on,
little bit more.
in a sense, and the good is simply defined by what you regard as the measure of human well-being, and
Yeah.
anything that basically points us in that direction
Yeah,
counts
and it's not
as the moral.
and it's not fully defined or anything else. But to pretend that we don't have some beginning understanding of it, I think is a bit ridiculous.
Okay. So what's, I mean, so I think very briefly, in a sense, that Matt is sketching out this idea that there is a secular morality.
Well, there's an example that came along with this that Glenn produced when he was listing off societal health versus religiosity and teeing me up for the Gregory S. Paul thing. He mentioned divorce rates. But that comes with the presumption that divorce is a bad thing.
Sure.
And I don't believe that. I'm recently divorced. Me and my ex-wife are as good friends now as we ever were and better. And we're both in agreement that it was absolutely the right thing for us to do. And so what's happened here is, from my perspective, and obviously people can disagree, religious thinking, religious teaching, religious dogma has done a number of great disservices to human beings by setting up a notion of a soulmate, by setting up the notion that marriage needs to be one man, one woman forever. That's caused countless problems. By setting up a view of death that does not allow people to deal with that. If we started with the notion that death is the eventual consequence of life, it would fundamentally change, and that was the end as far as we knew, and anything else would be a bonus. It would fundamentally change, I think, how we treated people while they were still alive. And so there's a number of problems here that are rooted in the theology, rooted in the notion that there's a God, which I think if you set those aside and just focus on the things that actually directly try to benefit human beings, it has to be better.
So it's all the benefits of Christianity plus a few more, because you haven't got some of the baggage, essentially.
Well, Matt said that he could write a Bible that's superior to the Bible by reversing its position on slavery. I think if you started from scratch without the Bible, though, I don't think you, and I don't think anyone has written a book or a series of books or a collection of books, a library of books, that has done what the Bible has done for slavery in the world. Because slavery is a human universal, and it has not been overturned by anyone other than those who took the Bible seriously back in the 18th century. They were evangelical Christians, they were Quakers, they were people who took the Bible seriously. So
parts of it seriously.
It's a longer discussion about how you take the Old Testament, but that's got to be interesting, at least, because we can't do a compare and contrast. There's no A/B testing about this. Okay, which
I think kind of undermines what you were just saying. And I sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm in agreement with you. Mm-hmm. You're viewing it as nobody else has done this, and you don't think anybody else could. And my thing is, we have no way to find that out because we live in a world where this is the way things happened, and so. To argue that you couldn't actually write a list of moral precepts from scratch that are superior to Christianity.
Well, but then aren't you saying, at least with the Christian side, we've got there is one group of people that has guaranteed universal equality for all human beings and has ended the slave trade. Okay, it might have taken far longer than you would have wanted it to have taken, but there is one group of people who have done that. We don't know if anyone has or could do that. Let's give it a go anyway. Let's walk away from this thing that has given us all these benefits of the universities and the hospitals and the schools and the scientific method and the emancipation of the slaves and all this sort of stuff. Let's walk away from that. That's quite a leap of faith, don't you think?
And am I also getting the sense, Glenn, that I want to come back to this human at the centre of this, and the fact that Matt says, hey, humans are humans, and it's natural that we're going to prefer ourselves, and that's where the morality comes from, our own best interests. And you're saying, no, somehow Christianity has actually grounded an intrinsic dignity to the human that Matt's godless ethics isn't necessarily going to support. It might go in that direction for a moment, but there's no ultimate foundation to it. Is that what I'm hearing
absolutely.
from you?
We are always going to look after ourselves, but who is we, and who are ourselves in that conversation? And we are always wanting to narrow the circle around us and our mates and exclude the other tribe and exclude the other kinds of people. So, in the news here in the UK, just recently they brought in a non-invasive prenatal test for Down syndrome. And it had the reliable effect that everybody knew it was going to have. As people knew that they were going to have children with Down syndrome, they aborted them at ever higher rates. And yet the headlines said, children with Down syndrome down 30%. And it sounded like people had found a cure for Down syndrome or something like that. They hadn't found a cure for Down syndrome. They'd just drawn the circle around humanity and kept those with that condition on the outside and wanted to eliminate them. And that, to me, is a very chilling way of proceeding with a kind of a humanism, because that's always the danger. Who is us? Who are those who we are going to grant with the right to life? And who are those who we are going to say, they do not qualify? And it's always tempting for the humans to say, okay, it's the strong who will make the decision, and it's the weak who must take the hindmost. What is it that's going to stand up for all humans, regardless of capacity, regardless of attributes, regardless of achievements? Who is it who's going to stand up for all humans and actually be true humanists and grant them human rights too?
This is the problem. So first of all, whether or not that abortion scenario that you're talking about is humanism or not is subject for a whole nother debate. But you say, well, nobody could do this. And then when we talk about, here's a list of precepts where we don't include a God in it, then your answer is, now you're just borrowing from Christianity. It's Christianity light, and you've just removed the God. And then the other objection that you're going to launch to secular morality is, what's going to be the foundation beyond this? At least we have a foundation. It's God. Well, what if people don't accept your foundation. That is exactly the same objection that you are leveraging, you're launching at secular humanism. Whatever problems secular humanism may have with regard to foundations of ethics, no religious foundation has any way of solving that. Because ultimately, until some God comes in and says, I am in fact the God of the universe and I am the moral authority, and people are forced to recognize that this is the case, then the only thing that's happening is Glenn's saying God is the foundation of morality and I'm saying humans are. And nobody is going to be, neither of those systems is going to work for people who don't accept that that's a foundation.
Do people have to all recognize this foundation in order for it to be the foundation?
No, people don't need to recognize that 2 + 2 = 4 for it to be the case that 2 + 2 = 4, and for you to go to your grave proclaiming that 2 + 2 = 4. Even if the whole world said it was otherwise, then 2 + 2 would still equal 4. People don't need to recognize a moral truth to be a moral truth for it to be moral.
They do if you're talking about a moral system. If you want to create, computer code and get people to start programming in it, you've got to be able to convince them about ones and zeros.
Yeah.
So 2 + 2 = 4 isn't even in the same ballpark of there is a God. It's either true or it's not, but it's not a foundation for something. If you're talking about a moral system, the true foundation is agreement on what the foundation is, that the three of us care about human beings. And then we can start arguing about how much we care and where there's going to be conflicts and everything else. But we can't do any of that until we agree on that foundation. And if Glenn's foundation is there's a God at the bottom of this and he can't demonstrate that, then we're not even going to get started on solving the problem.
That's not what 2 + 2 = 4 is the analog of in this conversation. 2 + 2 = 4 is the analog of all human beings are worthy of provision and protection. All of them. Right? Would you agree with that? All members of the human family, no matter what their achievements, no matter what their attributes, all members of the human family are worthy of all provision and protection.
I have no idea.
Mm-hmm. That's a problem. It's definitely a problem, especially when you've got people who are discovering disabled children in the womb.
When I say I have no idea, it's about that simplification. My instinct is, of course, to say yes.
It's a very Christian instinct.
Thank you. That's a very atheist response. The instinct, of course, say yes. The problem is that when we start talking about the specific language, there are going to be rights conflicts that we have to address.
Sure, but all other things being equal, as a general principle, would you say that what Glenn has laid down there is one that you could agree to? The importance of treating
sure,
all members of the
in the general colloquial sense, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And what's your point then, Glenn? That this 2 + 2 = 4, as it were, this agreement, that doesn't exist just on the basis of Matt's preferences. It's a fact in the way 2 + 2 = 4 is a fact, as far as you're concerned.
Yes.
See, and that I don't quite so much for you. That I don't agree with. It is certainly there are things that we're going to agree on. That I don't know how you could ever demonstrate that this is in fact like true, like some intrinsic truth about for example, I think human lives have incredible value. I don't think they have any intrinsic value. I don't think the universe cares at all about human life. They have value because they have value to us.
And who's us?
Humans.
All humans?
Well, cognitive able humans who are able to consider the proposition of whether or not they have value.
Which is the strong, and that's my problem, is that it becomes an ever shrinking circle of humanity that we have, and it's the strong who rule over the weak.
Well, the characterization of evolution as being strong over the weak, I would argue isn't necessarily accurate, but it's also because there's no decision there. It's whatever survives. And what is strong in one sense, a weakness may become a strength depending on the situation. That's what evolution does. It's not like, ooh, me, He-Man, you weak, I'm going to kill you type thing. Maybe, for example, sickle cell anemia provides protection against certain things. And so while it may be under certain circumstances, there's a reason why animals develop camouflage and other changes. It's because of the
why in
fact
your view
of the
was it wrong for, I'm sorry to invoke Godwin's law, even though we're near the end of the program, why was it wrong for Hitler and the Nazis to, euthanize disabled people and gay people and people that they felt were outside of their circle of who they considered to be human? What was the kind of
I'm not convinced they considered them outside the circle of what they consider to be human. They had a view that these were somehow inferior humans. I think they would all acknowledge they were human, just that they were somehow inferior or less diverging. Yeah, race. Things like that.
The master race.
So it's one of those things where people say,
because a lot of people would say Hitler was wrong about a fact there, whereas from what I'm wondering, like, and we're getting to the issue of, is there this objective moral value to humanity? And in a sense,
it reminds me of the people who argue that, hey, slavery is really good for the slave owners. And so if you're a slave owner, you can look at this and say, hey, slavery is a good thing because it benefits me. The problem is that when you look at the larger picture, it's actually not necessarily good for the slave owners. And beginning to recognize that every member of society affects potentially every other member fundamentally changes, and it shifts our in-group, out-group dynamic. So that when Hitler goes after the Jews for whatever religious reasons he had, for whatever superior, uber guy reasons he had, that's fundamentally different from whether or not killing them makes society worse or better. And it's kind of this thing of, this is what I think makes us better, which is independent from what actually makes us think better. Nobody, not Sam nor I nor anybody, is suggesting that if we begin with an agreement on well-being as a foundation, that there aren't going to be things that we think we have the right answer about and find out we were wrong.
At that stage, then, it would seem like instead of having World War II, we would have a symposium in which the Nazis would present their papers and others would present other papers, and then we'd have a panel and we'd discuss them and we'd try and thrash it out. At what stage do you say that their vision for updating, for evolving, for having a master race, at what stage do you say that is morally unjustified and therefore there is a just war that can be fought against them?
What? I don't know that there's an answer for that apart from assessing the individual situations, which is what we did. Mm-hmm. But we didn't have to rely on a God for it.
Well, we relied on 1939 years of Christian understanding of what is the good life, and the good life is the sacrifice of the strong for the protection of the weak, and Hitler was doing the exact opposite of that, and so it was very obvious to people in that sense, the evil of the Nazis, and they went and fought a just war against it. But
sure. So it was Christianity that was the credit for ending the Nazi regime, and why people, not even Judaism.
No, it was Christianity that had shaped the West and its moral sensibilities, such that Nazism appeared to them as very obviously the very reverse of the way of the cross.
So this is something that you just can't argue with, because it's just an assertion from Glenn's perspective, because if we come up with something that is good, we're borrowing from Christianity. There's no way to not be accused of borrowing because Christianity was around before. And if you find something that was before Christianity, well, that was foreshadowing Christianity. That because the God that he believes in has been there forever. Mm-hmm. So anything true and good that was pre-Christ was God foreshadowing it. And anything is after, it's somebody borrowing from it. There's no response to this. And there's also no way for him to demonstrate that that's what's happening.
Is that a fair criticism, Glenn?
Well, I think we've said from Old Testament to New Testament, we've said from Genesis 1, I totally believe in the same God from the beginning. But I think what is the unique thing about the Christian story is you've got the sacrifice of the fittest for the survival of the weakest. You've got this way of the cross. You've got this way of Jesus, which is unlike the Greco-Roman world. It's unlike the Persian world. It's unlike the Babylonians. It's unlike the Muslim world. It is very like what secular humanists now say about inclusion and welcome and diversity and bringing people to the center and caring for the weak and the
poor.
If
you're very selective about what you read, it'd be really nice about Christianity if it were the nice, unique feature of Christianity was if it could be demonstrated to be true. Mm-hmm. That would be a unique feature among religions, which would be very nice.
Well, we had the God who was the master, came down, became the slave. He paid the slave price.
I know the story.
Yeah.
You can't demonstrate it's true.
Well, we're living in the effects of it. We're living in the ripples of the
You can't
after
prove
effects
that's
of that
true
story.
either. That's just how you're viewing it. I don't think we're living in the rippled effects of people who believe that to be true, which is independent from whether or not it is true.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we've all got our different standards of what would qualify as evidence. For
Which
that
is
to be
why,
true
and
as well.
this is the thing. This is why I keep saying that I have yet to be presented with an objection from religious, an objection to secular morals that religion solve. And it's not, God could fix this. If there is a God, God could fix this just like that. Just like he could have said, thou shalt not own another human being as property. Instead, he was more concerned about wearing mixed fabrics and whether or not you should eat shrimp, evidently.
I mean, it's a conversation about the old covenant that we can have, but the old covenant's called old for a very good reason. What I've been saying again and again is...
Why would there be multiple covenants? Why can't God just say, here's the way things are?
That's just the law. That's just the law. The law does say, here's the way things are. But as we've both admitted, humans get things wrong. What we need is grace. What we need is the God who is the lawgiver to actually come and save us, to actually come and forgive us for all the different ways that we get things wrong.
So I don't think I need a God to come and save me or forgive me. I think I need a God to come down and demonstrate that he exists.
Mm-hmm. The God who comes down, in the Christian sense, is the God who becomes incarnate. But a number of times, Matt, you've used the word of God being sort of a super being, or I don't know, what was the phrase you used? Anyway, a super being, which I imagine to be something kind of within the created order, and who might appear in a cloud and that
Are you
sort
talking
of
about
thing.
today? Because the only time I talked about super being was when we were referencing Nazis.
No, super. Anyway, forgive me.
But carry on.
God is not one more item within the created order. He is the source of being, and so for you to say, why isn't God showing himself? It's a bit like Juliet saying, where is Shakespeare? Like in one sense, where isn't Shakespeare? Okay,
It's kind of the opposite of that, because in that category you have a fictional character asking where's the real one, and in this one you have the real character asking where's the fictional one.
Ah, but are you the fictional one?
I'm not. I'm the real one,
I'm a real boy.
as far as I can tell.
Yeah, and yet you did not give life to yourself.
Isn't one of Glenn's contentions, though, in a sense, that if you're looking for evidence for God, we find it by looking at the fact that we have this intrinsic view that humans are equal, and that isn't something that we can just deduce from science. Science doesn't have anything particularly to say to our moral values.
Because it's not a truth. It's not intrinsically true. It's not like 2 + 2 = 4.
It's not a mathematical truth. I mean, in terms of morality, are you an objective? Do you believe in objective moral values, or like?
Not the objective foundation, but the objective assessment with regard to the foundation. I think well-being is the best that we've come up with.
But in that sense, so science, as far as it can give us a morality, like Sam Harris says, is once we've agreed what the goal is, and then
right.
we can
If you
find
agree on what the goal is, then you can.
There's
use the
no
method.
ultimate sort of There's no ultimate foundation
Correct.
saying this is the way this is the goal we should all aspire to. But presumably, Glenn, you believe there is some kind of ultimate thing that we're made for, something we're about, a grand narrative we're living in.
Right.
And the fact that we recognise that somehow within ourselves, evidence for God, in your view?
You can make a moral argument for God's existence, yes. I do believe God is love, and the good life is to live in love, and I believe that not just Christians can recognize this, and not just Christians do recognize this.
Well, we can do the same thing. So this thing of the fact that we seem to have a desire for meaning, purpose, value, all of those things, he'll use as evidence for the God, because that serves as an explanation for it. I can do that with that exact same example. The reason that Glenn sees God as the justification for that is because he's uncomfortable with the possibility that there isn't an explanation for it, or that this isn't some sort of universal truth. So a preference for, I want there to be intrinsic human dignity, gets you to, hey, if there was a God, there would be human dignity because this God is guaranteeing it. And so that same circular preference is there. I'm just eliminating both of them and saying, I'm going to go ahead because I care about human beings and I value human beings because I am one, and say whether there's a God or not, this is what I'm going to go for. And if there's a God that has a better way, they can demonstrate it. Why isn't a Damascus Road experience good enough for everybody?
So the moral argument for God's existence is not that we need some kind of arbitrary moral figure who has some whims and he will enforce them at the point of hell, and therefore it would be better if we want to live in a moral world to believe in such a God. The moral argument for God's existence is there is an objective realm of moral values. And the explanation for that objective realm of moral values is not going to be a material cause, because morals are not material things, right? Moral values are not reducible to just biological reality, and thank God for that, because biological reality is the survival of the fittest, okay? But moral values are something distinct from biological values, natural values. You cannot get from those natural values to the ethical values. You can't get from an is to an ought. And you sure can't get from preferences to an ought. You can't get from a like to an ought.
Of course you can. You can always get from preferences to an ought.
No, you can only get from preferences to another preference. It just becomes another preference just backed up with force.
The problem is, well, all right, we're not going to necessarily. So first of all, I don't think we disagree on the is-ought dilemma. But as soon as you get into preferences, that's the objection. The reason you can't get from an is-ought is that you have to inject a preference. It's injecting the preference that gets you to the ought. I would like to live in a world where this happens, therefore I ought to do that. Mm-hmm. The objection on the is-ought thing is this thing. If I start with the foundation of I would like to, it's not a problem with what it leads to, but why should I like
with
to?
The power, I suppose, is what I'm getting. Glenn is saying, if the person in power, say the Hitler, simply has a very different conception of what the best is for his life compared to your life, then do you have any moral, if you like, force to say you're doing something wrong? Isn't he just going with his preferences as opposed to your preferences?
Yes.
So what is it that's up here that says those preferences are better and those preferences are worse? What is that?
This is the objection that's often launched. So I could sit down with Hitler. I wouldn't, because he's dead. But I could sit down with Hitler, and if we could find the thing that we agree about, that we care about, we can then demonstrate which one of our preferences are in conflict with that. Because what we do as human beings is often delude ourselves, and we look at our preferences and assume they're right. But they're going to conflict with something foundational, which is basically at the beginning of that superiority to secular morality talk, I talked about how you could begin with, let's say, 3 foundational premises. Life is generally preferable to death, health is generally preferable to sickness, and pleasure is generally preferable to pain. None of them are universally true. Sometimes pain is preferable. Sometimes death may be preferable, which is why I support death with dignity for people who no longer have any hope of a quality of life and with their individual autonomy and control over their own life. But you can begin with those and you can build something. But you can start with anything. You could start with death is better than life, and what you get to is extinction. Sure. And so if I find something, I think Hitler probably, there's the old joke, Hitler probably loved his mother too. Hitler probably valued human life, just had justifications for excluding certain others.
Right.
And you think you could reason Hitler into...
I don't know that I necessarily could.
Why
because
wouldn't he
there are
reason
people,
you into his way?
It might be. I'm not saying that that's not necessarily the case. I'm saying if you can show that what your actions are and the things that you're justifying are in conflict with a foundation that you agree with, that's where the problem is.
Right. And what if it's the establishment of the master race? Because if the fittest do survive, then wouldn't it be nice if the fittest should survive? Like, we take that hop, skip, and a jump, and
sure. And then you ask what criteria are you using to determine fittest?
And again, we're having a symposium when we should be fighting a war, and this is.
No, we should always be having a symposium so we don't have to fight wars. Why would anybody ever say we should be fighting a war?
You sound like Neville Chamberlain. You know, I found peace in our time with Hitler because I'm going to sit down with him.
Well, and I'm sorry that advocating for reasoning rather than blowing crap up is so anathema.
I think we tried to reason with him.
I'm not saying, here's where the confusion is. I'm not saying after the war started, send Matt in and he can sit down with Hitler and solve it.
He's very clever.
We're using a precise example to talk about a more abstract one, which is essentially, let's say you and I disagree on, you want to take some action. You want to exterminate some portion of the population. The process that I'm advocating for is for us to figure out what shared foundation we have, if any, which We'll find something shared and show which one of us is more in conflict with and which one of us is more in keeping with that foundation. Is it always going to be the case? No. But you asked how you would actually solve that, and I would. And if it didn't work, I'd kill him.
and if well-being, just very vaguely just defined, if well-being is the metric that we're using, and if Hitler could say, "Oh, we are so much better off without the disabled," you have no idea. You know, we're soaring our industry, our numbers are through the roof. Our well-being is doing incredibly well once we eliminate the sick, the weak, the handicapped. Is he right at that point?
Well, that's when you go through and you talk about what data are you looking at to define well-being, because
what data?
Yeah.
You're having that conversation about the data because he's just told you I've eliminated the handicapped.
It's not like I'm talking. No.
Okay, because it is happening right now. Okay, there is a Down syndrome population, for instance, that's being eliminated globally right now, and we're having a conversation about it. Okay, and I think it's better to have a conversation than to blow people up and all that sort of stuff. But it's a very live issue. I mean, it's not just the Godwin's rule.
I'm just going with the example that you say. Hitler comes to me and says, "You wouldn't believe how much better our society is off now that we're eliminating these people." Then you have to go back and look at it and say, "Okay, what have you lost? Is your society better, and are you just looking at the short term? Did you, in fact, how do you know that you didn't lose a cure for disease? How do you know that you're not worse off because it has fundamentally changed your psyche? How do you know that you're not worse off because you've lost art, because you've lost human connection?" It's not just, see, this is one of the problems that you could point out to people that are going down there. Well-being is not just what's my financial
well-being. Aren't those people's lives
worth
worth something, even if they didn't produce a cure for cancer or great works of art? Even if they just, sat around and consumed all the resources that all the able-bodied people were doing.
If somebody sat around and did nothing but consume, I don't know how you could consider that as adding value. You have to point to something where they're adding value to society.
So they have to achieve, they have to add value. But they don't have value.
Yeah. So this is what I'm saying when I say that there's no intrinsic value to it, but that I value human life, and that everybody, almost everybody,
seems. Who's I? You, Matt Dillahunty.
I'm speaking specifically for me, but also
but if
I
someone
think
else doesn't. You try to reason them out of it, but
yes. What do you? Okay, see, you sit there and you. Okay, let's try it. I don't value human life. Change my mind.
Look at the Nazis. Look at that vision of humanity.
I don't care. I don't value human life. Change my mind.
You have yourself a humanity that has dignity. You might not believe it right now.
I don't. Change my mind.
I'm trying to change your mind by saying, without achievements, without attributes, without contributing a penny of money, without expending a calorie of effort.
I worry, by the way, that this is going to get cut as if this is really me saying this when it's not.
And I'm counseling you or something. Yeah, I'm your therapist.
I don't even understand why this point is remotely contentious.
What's your point here, though? That if you simply choose not to believe humans have value, then nothing that he's going to say is going to change your mind.
Right, telling me that there's a God or a Jesus, that's not going to necessarily change my mind any more than my line of reasoning.
So what's your point then, Glenn? Because
my point is that the changing of the mind is not the most important factor that's going on here. It's the immorality of eliminating a whole people group. That's probably a little bit more important.
And I think
than someone's openness. It's a conversation.
We're talking about someone who doesn't value human life.
Yes.
Not what they've done, but what they think.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
You have to figure out a way to change their mind.
And the best way we've discovered over 2,000 years is to tell a story about the God who becomes the weak and despised and the marginalized and the single cell in Mary's womb.
And I think we can do better than telling a story.
But you think, but what evidence do you have?
Well, give it a shot. There's no reason to think it's not worse. It's any worse.
Except all the scientific studies that are cited.
Brings us nicely to the end of the show. And I'm just going to ask that question one last time. Can atheism deliver a better world in your view, Matt?
I have no idea. And that's genuine. I think that there are things that if you take the good, wherever you find it, religion, non-religious, philosophical thinking, take those things, keep them, get rid of the baggage. How could we not be better off?
And your final thoughts on that one too?
Well, I guess what follows from atheism? I mean, atheism just a lack of belief in a God. I don't think any kind of moral system necessarily falls out of that. If we're biological survival machines clinging to an insignificant rock, hurtling through a meaningless universe towards eternal extinction, what follows? One thing that might follow is nothing. Another thing that might follow is anything. And therefore, I think, Matt's venture is very much a venture of faith. We want to create more atheists, or at least create more skeptics about the idea of religion, when everything we know about the utility of religion is that it's a net gain, a net win to society, and when the consequences of getting rid of this story, especially this story of the God who became weak, is to have a certain callousness to the whole rest of society. And I think that meta-ethical issue will play out in negative ways about how we treat the least and the last and the lost.
And I agree with him that atheism doesn't necessarily lead to anything, which is why I keep advocating for secular humanism. But when you say that everything we've learned, religion has been a net gain, I'm not convinced.
Well, look, I've really enjoyed the conversation. So, Matt and Glenn, thank you very much for being with me.
Thank you,
Justin. Thank you, Matt.
Absolutely, thanks.
I hope you enjoyed Glenn and Matt debating atheism and morality. There's also a bonus video of them discussing the trans controversy that divided the atheist experience. Get it now, along with loads more exclusive content, by subscribing to our newsletter at thebigconversation.show.